Lake Powell is once again at the center of a federal balancing act, but the real question is not simply whether the reservoir can be kept from dropping too far. It is what has to give elsewhere in the Colorado River system to make that happen, who absorbs the tradeoff, and how long one reservoir can be protected by borrowing water and margin from another. On Friday, the United States Bureau of Reclamation moved to shore up Powell by sending extra water toward the lake and cutting back the amount released downstream to Lake Mead. The decision was framed as a way to keep Powell above a critical threshold, but it also puts added pressure on Hoover Dam power production and leaves the broader river negotiations unresolved. The timing matters because the spring runoff picture has worsened sharply. Reclamation's April 2-month study says Lake Powell began the operational year with an elevation band that placed it in the mid-elevation release tier, but the same report also shows inflow forecasts falling hard. April through July unregulated inflow into Powell is projected at only 1.40 million acre-feet, or 22% of average, and the full water year inflow forecast stands at 3.87 million acre-feet, or 40% of average. The weekly hydrologic update released April 20 shows Powell at 3,526.08 feet, or about 1,074.75 meters, with current snowpack at just 23% of normal. Lake Mead, meanwhile, was at 1,058.81 feet, or about 322.73 meters, with total system contents at 36% of capacity. The federal response has two parts. First, Reclamation said it will move 660,000 to 1 million acre-feet of water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir at the Wyoming-Utah border to help prop up flows into Powell. That is roughly 814 million to 1.23 billion cubic meters of water. Second, it will cut releases from Powell to Mead by nearly 20%, from a previously planned 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million acre-feet, or about 9.23 billion cubic meters, to 7.40 billion cubic meters. Reclamation said the combined measures are designed to keep Powell near 3,500 feet, or about 1,066.8 meters, by April 2027, instead of allowing it to sink as low as 3,446 feet, or about 1,049.94 meters, under the forecast scenario without those actions. That protection for Powell comes with a built-in catch. The Bureau and Arizona officials have said the reduced Powell to Mead release will not reduce the amount of water Mead delivers to cities and farms in Arizona, California, and Nevada, including Tucson, which relies on Colorado River water for nearly all of its drinking supply. But the lower releases are expected to reduce the hydropower generated at Hoover Dam, the structure that impounds Lake Mead, and Reclamation said the reduction could cut the dam's generating capacity by 40%. The power from Hoover Dam is sold to customers serving about 8 million people across the Southwest, including electricity used to pump river water uphill to Phoenix and Tucson through the Central Arizona project. The operational concern behind the move is straightforward. Powell sits above Glen Canyon Dam, and if the lake falls below 3,490 feet, or 1,063.75 meters, the turbines at the dam can no longer generate power. If the lake drops farther below that level, the ability to send water through the dam to the Grand Canyon and onward toward Mead also weakens because flows must pass through outlet works rather than the turbines. Those outlet works are not meant to carry heavy water flows for extended periods, which is why managers have been trying for years to avoid crossing that threshold. Reclamation's action is built around keeping Powell above that line for as long as technically feasible. The latest numbers show why the concern is not abstract. Powell's current elevation of 3,526.08 feet is only a little above the 3,490-foot power cutoff, and the Bureau's forecast says that without the new operational changes, the lake could fall to 3,446 feet by April 2027. That is a gap of 80 feet, or about 24.38 meters, between today's level and the lower forecast. The April 2026 study also says the lowest probable inflow scenario for Powell this year would put the lake at 3,482 feet by August, which is below the 3,490-foot threshold, while the most probable forecast puts that crossing by September if no artificial boost is added. In other words, The reservoir is not being managed with extra room to spare. It is being managed against a narrowing window. The federal announcement also landed in the middle of a longer and still unfinished set of negotiations among the 7 Colorado River Basin states. Those talks have been deadlocked for 2 years, with no final compromise on long-term river management yet in hand. Reclamation said it is still taking input from the basin states, tribal leaders, Mexico, and other stakeholders, and the Bureau said a final decision on the short-term operational plan would come the following week. That is a reminder that the April action is not a permanent settlement. It is a stopgap response inside a system that still lacks an agreed post-2026 operating framework. The basin-wide stress is already visible in how quickly the projections are moving. Reclamation's forecast says Powell could fall below 3,490 feet by August under the lowest probable scenario, and by September under the most probable one, a shift that is earlier than the agency's previous March forecast. The Bureau's own hydrologic update shows Powell inflow forecast values being marked down, with April through July unregulated inflow now estimated at just 1.40 million acre-feet, or 22% of normal. That kind of runoff profile does not merely signal a dry year. It changes reservoir operations downstream, because each release decision at Powell ripples into Mead, and then into Hoover Dam's power output and the lower basin's shortage accounting. The outlook for Lake Mead is not detached from Powell's emergency measures. Mead stood at 1,058.81 feet in the April 20 update and was projected at 1,056.36 feet by the end of the calendar year, a drop of 2.45 feet, or about 0.75 meters from the current reading. That forecast was based on the April 24-month study and reflects continuing shortage conditions. Even though the Powell release cut does not change the water deliveries cities and farms receive directly, it can still change Mead's operating environment by shrinking inflow from upstream and reducing the amount of water available for hydropower generation at Hoover Dam. The catch, then, is not that household taps suddenly go dry. The catch is that the reservoir system becomes less flexible just as the hydrologic margin is shrinking. That loss of flexibility matters because the Colorado River system depends on carefully timed releases, not just total annual volume. Reclamation's April study makes clear that the system is already operating under shortage conditions for Lake Mead in calendar year 2026, and that lower basin projections also account for conservation work already in the pipeline. The same document notes that the August 2025-24-month study put Mead in the shortage range for January of this year, while Powell's release tier for water year 2026 was set at mid-elevation release. Those labels may sound technical, but they determine how much water is moved, when it is moved, and how much risk is left on the table for the next forecast cycle. The system's weakness is being exposed by the weather pattern itself. Reclamation says Powell's March unregulated inflow was 0.350 million acre-feet, or 59% of the 30-year average, while the April inflow forecast is 0.550 million acre-feet, or 61% of average. That sounds modest until it is placed beside the much weaker April through July forecast of 1.40 million acre-feet, or 22% of average. Snowpack across the upper basin is also only 23% of normal, according to the weekly update. With that kind of runoff outlook, the reservoir is being managed not for abundance, but for damage control. The downstream consequences are not limited to electricity. Hoover Dam's hydropower is part of the resource mix that supports water delivery infrastructure across the Southwest, including systems that move water uphill to major population centers. Reclamation's warning that generation could fall by 40% is important because it turns a reservoir-level decision into an energy system issue. It also means that the same shortage conditions stressing agriculture and municipal supply are now squeezing the ability to produce power at the same time. That is one reason the federal government described the Powell action as necessary to protect the system, not just one lake. If Powell drops below 3,490 feet, the Glen Canyon turbines can no longer generate electric power, and if the lake falls lower still, the ability to send water through the dam to the Grand Canyon and Mead diminishes. That makes the current move less of a discretionary maneuver than a guardrail against a worse operational failure. The federal plan is not designed to solve the basin's drought problem. It is designed to delay a more severe one. Even so, the reservoir numbers suggest that delay is being bought at a steep price. Powell's current elevation of 3,526.08 feet leaves only 36.08 feet, or about 11.00 meters, before the 3,490-foot threshold. Mead's current elevation of 1,058.81 feet leaves it still far below fuller historical operating levels, and the basin's total system contents are at 36% of capacity. Those figures explain why the Bureau is shifting water between reservoirs now instead of waiting for a summer emergency. The system is already shallow enough that one bad runoff season can force a cascade of operational changes. At the same time, the reduction from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million acre-feet is not a small bookkeeping adjustment. It is a large operational change that effectively withholds 1.48 million acre-feet from Powell's scheduled downstream release, equivalent to about 1.83 billion cubic meters. That water is being used in effect as a reservoir savings account for Powell, while Mead and Hoover Dam absorb the immediate downstream effect. Reclamation's strategy is built on the idea that preserving Powell's minimum operating range is worth the strain it places on the rest of the system. The catch is that every such move narrows the room for error in the next round of forecasts. That is also why the negotiations among the 7 basin states matter so much. Reclamation has said the states remain at the table, but without a compromise, the federal government has indicated it may have to produce its own post-2026 operating plan. The current action is therefore taking place inside a much larger unresolved policy fight, one that has already outlasted multiple forecast cycles and now sits under a worsening hydrologic trend. The basin is not just dealing with one dry season. It is dealing with the possibility that the basic rules for sharing the river will have to be rewritten under pressure. The immediate adjustments at Lake Powell do not exist in isolation, and the numbers already outlined begin to converge on a more structural constraint. The system is being forced to operate closer to its minimum thresholds, while demand, infrastructure, and legal obligations were designed around far higher average flows. The reduction in releases from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million acre-feet is not just a one-year operational tweak. It signals a deeper recalibration of how risk is distributed between reservoirs that were once managed with wider buffers. That recalibration becomes more apparent when the projected inflow of 3.87 million acre-feet for the full water year is set against historical norms. At 40% of average, the gap is not incremental, it is systemic. That gap explains why upstream reservoirs such as Flaming Gorge are now part of the operational equation. Moving between 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet downstream toward Powell effectively redistributes stored water from one part of the upper basin to another. In volumetric terms, that transfer represents hundreds of billions of gallons being repositioned to maintain a single reservoir above a functional threshold. The fact that such transfers are now being deployed more readily underscores how little surplus remains in the system as a whole. Each upstream release used to stabilize Powell reduces the capacity of those reservoirs to serve their own contingencies later in the year or in subsequent years. At the same time, the interplay between Powell and Mead introduces a compounding effect rather than a simple trade. By reducing Powell's release, Mead receives less inflow, even if direct water deliveries to lower basin users are maintained through accounting mechanisms and prior agreements. That means Mead must rely more heavily on its existing storage to meet obligations, which in turn affects its elevation trajectory. The projection showing Mead at 1,056.36 feet by the end of the calendar year reflects this pressure. A drop of 2.45 feet may appear modest on its own, roughly 0.75 meters, but in a system already operating at 36% capacity, incremental declines accumulate quickly when inflow remains constrained. The energy dimension continues to expand as a consequence of these hydrologic adjustments. Hoover Dam's potential reduction in generating capacity by up to 40% is not simply a loss of surplus electricity. It has operational implications for water delivery systems that depend on consistent power availability. The Central Arizona project, which lifts water hundreds of feet across long distances, operates within a framework where energy cost and availability are integral to maintaining steady supply. When generation drops, replacement power must be sourced, often at higher cost or with different reliability characteristics. This introduces a secondary layer of stress that is not immediately visible in reservoir elevation figures, but becomes increasingly relevant over time. Another factor emerging from the current projections is the compression of seasonal variability. Under more typical hydrologic conditions, spring and early summer inflows would provide a pronounced increase in reservoir levels, creating a buffer that could be drawn down later in the year. The current forecast of 1.40 million acre-feet for April through July, at just 22% of average, indicates that this seasonal recharge is significantly muted. Without a strong inflow pulse, reservoirs do not gain the elevation needed to sustain extended releases or absorb operational adjustments without approaching critical thresholds. The system, in effect, loses one of its primary mechanisms for self-correction. The narrowing margin is also evident in the difference between projected outcomes with and without intervention. The forecast that Powell could fall to 3,446 feet without the current measures, compared to a target of approximately 3,500 feet with them, represents a managed gap of 54 feet, or about 16.46 meters. That difference is being achieved through a combination of reduced releases and upstream supplementation, not through improved natural inflow. In other words, the system is compensating for hydrologic deficit through operational control rather than environmental recovery. This distinction matters because operational controls have limits, particularly when multiple reservoirs approach lower bounds simultaneously. The cumulative effect of these dynamics is a system that is increasingly sensitive to forecast error. When snowpack sits at 23% of normal and inflow projections are already reduced, even minor deviations in precipitation or temperature-driven melt rates can shift outcomes by several feet of elevation. In a reservoir operating just tens of feet above a critical threshold, that variability carries significant consequences. The difference between crossing below 3,490 feet in August versus September, as indicated in the projections, may appear small in temporal terms, but it can determine whether emergency measures need to be escalated or whether existing interventions are sufficient. The broader operational strategy also suggests a prioritization hierarchy that is becoming more explicit. Maintaining Powell above minimum power pool is being treated as a foundational requirement, even if it necessitates reduced hydropower generation at Hoover Dam and increased strain on Mead. This reflects the role of Glen Canyon Dam not only as a power facility but as a control point for downstream flows. If Powell were to fall below levels where controlled releases become constrained, the entire downstream system would face more severe disruptions than those associated with reduced power generation alone. The current approach is therefore aimed at preventing a more complex failure mode, even at the expense of efficiency elsewhere. For now, the system remains in a state where each reservoir's status cannot be considered independently. Powell's elevation, Mead's storage, Hoover Dam's generation capacity, and upstream reservoir levels are all linked through a series of decisions that redistribute water and risk across the basin. The federal action to protect Lake Powell addresses one of the most immediate constraints, but it does so by shifting the burden elsewhere within a network that has limited capacity to absorb additional strain.